Humans had been trying to escape reality for at least 5,000 years. The methods had changed, but the results hadn't, and no single life proved that better than the one you were about to hear. This is James Calvert. He was a farmer from Ohio who enlisted in the Union Army in 1861 at the age of 22, healthy and completely ordinary, and he had absolutely no idea that the next few years of his life were going to connect him to something that had started thousands of years before he was born. To understand James, we had to go back in time. It's 3400 BC. The Sumerians had just found a strange plant growing between the two rivers, covered in seed pods that released a sticky resin when they were cut open. They collected it, used it, and discovered that pain became easier to ignore and everything felt a little warmer. They called it the joy plant, which was about as honest as ancient drug names got. The knowledge spread, eventually reaching Egypt, and the Egyptians were already very comfortable with things that altered the way you felt. They were making beer and wine in huge amounts, and workers building the pyramids were given several liters of beer a day as part of their wages. But apparently beer wasn't enough, because the Egyptians also had the blue water lily. They soaked it in wine and drank the mixture when they wanted the evening to feel a little different. Nobody had a chemistry textbook explaining what was happening inside their brains. They just knew it worked. Rome took a different approach. Roman winemakers discovered that lead acetate made wine taste sweeter, so they put it in the wine. The wine tasted better, but nobody knew the lead was slowly poisoning them, so wealthy Romans kept drinking it for years. Rome was building roads, conquering countries, and creating one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, while some of its richest people were quietly poisoning themselves because they wanted sweeter wine. Humanity always had strange priorities. In Greece, wine had an entire god, Dionysus, in festivals where drinking heavily became part of the celebration. The Greeks did have one rule, though. Proper Greeks mixed wine with water because drinking it straight was considered barbaric, although that didn't stop them from drinking plenty. In India, people were grinding cannabis leaves with milk and spices and making bhang. The tradition went back thousands of years and survived for centuries. Around 440 BC, Herodotus watched Scythians throw cannabis onto hot stones inside a sealed tent and breathe in the smoke. He wrote about it like a man who had just seen something extremely strange, while the Scythians seemed to think it was a wonderful idea. Across East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, people were chewing Khat to stay awake, alert, and talkative for hours. The practice was already ancient when anyone bothered to write about it, and it survived for generations. Then Asia had Betel Nut. People ground it with lime, wrapped it in a leaf, and chewed it while they talked, rested, traded, or visited friends. It was basically an ancient coffee break, except it stained your teeth red. The practice was more than 3,000 years old, and hundreds of millions of people still used it. Then there was tobacco. The Maya and other Mesoamerican peoples used it in religious ceremonies, burned it as an offering, smoked it through pipes, and blew it over people as part of ritual purification. Tobacco was sacred, controlled, and serious. Then Europeans arrived. They saw what the locals were doing, took tobacco home, removed most of the religious meaning, and turned it into a commercial product. Less than a century later, something that had been a sacred plant had become a mass-market habit, and eventually tobacco would kill more people than most wars in human history. On the other side of the world, the Inca were chewing coca leaves during long mountain journeys because it helped with hunger and exhaustion. They used it in religion, trade, and daily life. It worked so well that nobody had much reason to ask what would happen if someone figured out how to make it stronger. Someone eventually did. But first, James Calvert needed to get shot. Spring 1862, the Battle of Shiloh. A Confederate rifle ball passed through James's left thigh and dropped him into the mud. A field surgeon found him, opened his bag, and pulled out something that doctors genuinely believed would save his life. It would. It would also quietly destroy the next 40 years of it. Morphine. A German chemist named Friedrich Serturner had pulled it from opium in 1804 and named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Whether that had been poetic or a warning depended entirely on what happened next. The The surgeon injected it into James using a hypodermic needle, and suddenly this badly wounded man could be operated on without feeling the pain he should have been screaming from. For James, it was a miracle. He had no reason to think otherwise. Nobody around him did. And that was the problem.
By the end of the Civil War, enormous numbers of soldiers had come home dependent on morphine. They eventually gave the condition a name: soldier's disease. James came home in 1864 with a healed leg and a body that had reorganized itself around one daily need: morphine. He tried whiskey. It helped a little, but not enough. His doctor gave him laudanum, which was basically opium dissolved in alcohol. If you were keeping track, James had just been handed 2 of his existing problems in one brown bottle, and he could buy it from a pharmacy without a prescription. The Victorians already knew opium could be addictive. Thomas de Quincey had written an entire best-selling memoir about his own addiction back in 1821. People read it, they understood it, and then they continued selling laudanum to everyone. James drank it. It helped, just not for long enough. Then 1886 arrived. A pharmacist in Atlanta named John Pemberton, himself a Civil War veteran who was struggling with morphine addiction, created a new medicinal tonic. He mixed coca leaf extract, which contained cocaine, with caffeine from cola nuts and called it Coca-Cola. James's doctor recommended it. James tried it, and for a few weeks he felt better than he had in years, which made perfect sense considering what he was drinking. The cocaine was eventually removed from the formula in 1903. The medical claims disappeared around the same time, and Coca-Cola became something much simpler: a drink. James thought the nightmare was finally over. It wasn't. In 1898, the Bayer pharmaceutical company in Germany produced something new from morphine. They tested it and marketed it as a cure for morphine addiction. They called it heroin. The claim lasted about 3 years before reality disagreed, loudly and permanently. James's doctor read the medical literature, saw what Bayer was saying, and prescribed it with complete confidence. If you were still keeping track, this was the 3rd substance James had been given specifically to treat his addiction to the substance he had been given before it. James died in 1903. His death certificate said natural causes. The problem was that in 1903, the language needed to explain what had actually happened to James over 40 years of confident medical decisions barely existed, and his doctors didn't think that they were destroying him. Most of them had genuinely believed they were helping. Then the 20th century arrived, and the drugs didn't slow down. They accelerated. Amphetamines had existed since the late 19th century, but they became famous during the Second World War when militaries began giving stimulants to soldiers and pilots who needed to stay awake and keep going long after their bodies wanted to stop. The German military alone distributed millions of methamphetamine tablets under the brand name Pervitin. Before the war, the same drug had even been marketed to German housewives as something that could help them get through their chores faster, which was one of those ideas that probably sounded much better before anyone stopped to think about it. Then came 1943. A Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann was working in his laboratory when he accidentally absorbed a tiny amount of LSD. He started feeling strange, so he got on his bicycle and rode home. He later described the experience in his notes as an unusual intoxication with an extremely stimulated imagination, which was a remarkably calm way for a man who was accidentally having an acid trip to describe what was happening to him. By this point, the pattern was getting difficult to miss. People kept finding something that worked, then they used it too much, then they discovered the problems, then they found something else, and then they did it again. That was what James Calvert's life had really been. It had started with the Sumerians' joy plant, then moved through thousands of years of people finding plants and substances that could change pain, pleasure, energy, sleep, or consciousness. It was the Egyptians soaking blue water lilies in wine, Roman aristocrats drinking lead-sweetened wine and thinking they were enjoying something sophisticated, the coca leaf being used by people in the Andes and eventually being extracted and turned into a medicinal drink in Georgia, and morphine being pulled from opium and injected into a wounded Civil War soldier, followed by laudanum, Coca-Cola, and heroin when the previous solution stopped solving the problem. 5,000 years of human beings finding something that worked, using it until it didn't, and then reaching for the next thing with exactly the same confidence they had placed in the last one. James hadn't been unlucky.
He had been ordinary. Thousands of men had walked through the same pharmacies, swallowed the same bottles, and listened to doctors who genuinely believed that this time was different. They weren't stupid. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They simply kept discovering the same lesson and forgetting it again. Humans hadn't spent 5,000 years inventing drugs. They had spent 5,000 years inventing new ways to solve the same problem and then being surprised every single time when the solution became the next problem.